Ethan Harper's footsteps echoed through the nearly deserted streets of Manhattan, the chill of the winter night biting through his coat. It had been a long day at the office, and all he wanted was to get home, pour himself a glass of bourbon, and forget about the endless meetings and corporate drama. But as he rounded the corner to his building, something caught his attention, something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A hauntingly beautiful melody drifted through the crisp air, the notes so pure and filled with emotion that it felt like they were pulling at his very soul. He looked around and found the source of the music. A young woman standing at the edge of the sidewalk, her fingers dancing over the strings of a worn violin. Her clothes were simple, almost shabby, but the way she played was anything but ordinary. The world seemed to fall away as Ethan watched her, mesmerized. She finished the piece with a gentle flourish, letting the last note linger in the night like a breath held too long. Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest, a sensation that was both unsettling and exhilarating. Without really thinking, he approached her. "That was incredible," he said, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. The woman looked up, her eyes, a piercing shade of green, meeting his with a mixture of surprise and guardedness. "Thank you," she replied softly, lowering her violin. "I didn't think anyone was listening." Ethan hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched on her delicate features, the way her shoulders sagged slightly as if carrying a weight no one else could see. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. She offered a small, almost wistful smile. "I'm fine. Just playing for myself, I guess." The wind picked up, swirling her auburn hair around her face. Ethan felt a sudden urge to do something, anything, to help this stranger who seemed to hold so much pain behind her eyes. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, glancing at the violin case lying open on the ground, its interior heartbreakingly empty. "I do," she said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "I mean, I'm not homeless or anything, if that's what you're thinking." "I didn't mean to assume," Ethan said quickly, feeling a pang of guilt. "It's just, I don't know. It seems like you shouldn't be out here alone at this hour. It's freezing." For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the city bustling around them as if oblivious to the quiet exchange happening on its fringes. Finally, she sighed, hugging the violin close to her chest. "I'm Grace," she said, her voice almost lost in the hum of traffic. "Grace Dawson." "Ethan Harper," he replied, offering his hand. "Nice to meet you, Grace." She looked at his hand for a moment, as if weighing the decision, and then took it with a hesitant smile. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold night. "Thanks for listening, Ethan. It means more than you know." He found himself smiling back, the kind of smile that felt rare and genuine. "Do you want to grab a coffee? I know a place nearby that's still open." Grace hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an excuse to say no. But then she nodded, just once, her eyes softening. "Yeah, I'd like that." And just like that, something shifted between them. A delicate thread of connection that neither of them fully understood, but both felt in the deepest part of their hearts. They walked together to the small, dimly lit cafe around the corner, their breaths visible in the cold air, the city a silent witness to this unexpected meeting. As they sat across from each other, nursing steaming cups of coffee, Grace began to open up, her words tentative but sincere. She spoke of her love for music, how it had been her anchor through the hardest times, and how she'd ended up playing on the streets after leaving everything behind in a small town no one had ever heard of. Ethan listened, captivated by the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her passion, and the way they clouded over when she spoke of her past. He shared bits of his own life too, the suffocating expectations of his family, the relentless pursuit of success that had left him feeling empty and alone. In a matter of hours, they spoke more openly than they had with anyone else in years. When they finally left the cafe, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Ethan felt a strange sense of loss as they stood in front of his building, knowing this night was about to end. "Thank you for tonight, Grace," he said softly. I needed this." She smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to light up her whole face. "Me too," Ethan, maybe I'll see you around? He nodded, hoping more than anything that she meant it. Yeah, I'd like that. With a final glance, Grace turned and walked away, her violin case swinging gently at her side. Ethan watched her disappear into the morning mist, a strange feeling blossoming in his chest. It wasn't love, at least, not yet, but it was something real and fragile and full of promise. And as he stood there, shivering in the early morning cold, he couldn't shake the sense that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and shared conversations. Despite their seemingly different worlds, Ethan and Grace found themselves drawn to each other in a way neither of them had expected. It started with brief meetings after Ethan's workday ended, a coffee here, a late-night walk there. Each encounter revealed a little more about who they were beneath the surface. Grace was a mystery Ethan wanted to unravel. She had this way of blending strength and vulnerability that both fascinated and confused him. She'd laugh easily, her eyes sparkling with a light that belied the hardships she had hinted at. Yet, there were times when she would go quiet, her gaze distant, as if she were haunted by something she couldn't quite let go of. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, Grace finally let her guard down. "I used to play in small concerts back home," she began, her voice soft but steady. "In a town where dreams were considered a luxury. I wanted to be someone, to make my parents proud. But things didn't go as planned." Ethan leaned closer, his heart aching for her. "What happened?" She hesitated, then sighed. "My father died suddenly. Cancer. And everything fell apart. My mother needed help, and I couldn't just leave her. So, I gave up music, took a job at a diner, and stayed. When she passed away a year later, I felt like I had lost everything. My family, my dreams, even myself. I needed to get away, to find a new path. That's how I ended up here, with nothing but my violin and a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, I could start over." The pain in her voice was palpable, and Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." She looked at their intertwined hands and smiled faintly. "It's been tough. But meeting you, talking like this, it's been a relief. Like I'm finally breathing again." There was something in her eyes then, a flicker of hope, a softening of the lines of worry that had become etched on her face. Ethan's heart twisted. He wanted to protect that hope, to be someone she could rely on. "I'm here," he said quietly. "Whatever you need, I'm here." Grace squeezed his hand, and for a moment, they just sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. It felt right, as if the world had conspired to bring them together at exactly the right time. Days turned into weeks, and their bond grew stronger. Grace began to play her violin again, the music returning to her life like a long-lost friend. Ethan found himself making excuses to see her, to hear the sound of her laughter, to watch the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her favorite composers. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years, the constant pressure of his job and family expectations fading into the background whenever he was with her. One night, after a particularly enchanting performance in the park, Grace turned to him. Her cheeks flushed from the cool evening air and the exhilaration of playing. "I'm pregnant, Ethan," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words hit him like a jolt, and for a second, he couldn't breathe. He stared at her, searching her face for what? Doubt? Fear? But all he saw was a mixture of vulnerability and strength that took his breath away. "Are you sure?" he managed to ask, his mind racing. He felt a storm of emotions, shock, confusion, and a strange, undeniable joy. Grace nodded, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I found out last week. I wasn't sure how to tell you, or if I should, but I wanted you to know." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it over hers. "Grace, this is... he struggled to find the right words. "I'm happy. Scared, but happy. I never expected this, but it's us, right? We'll figure it out." Relief washed over her features, and she smiled, her eyes filling with unshed tears. I was so afraid you'd be upset, or that you'd think I was trying to trap you." "God, no," he said quickly, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Grace. We'll get through this together." For a moment, they just held each other, the world around them fading into insignificance. But as the initial shock began to wear off, reality set in. Ethan's family, the expectations, the judgments. He could already hear their voices, the biting comments, the incredulity. "You can't tell them, can you?" Grace's voice was quiet, but the pain was clear. He pulled back, looking into her eyes. "I'll tell them. Just give me some time. I need to figure out how." Grace nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "I understand. But Ethan, I don't want to be your secret. Not me, and not our child." Her words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea all at once. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind a whirl of fear and love, uncertainty and hope. "I promise," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make this right." As he held her close, Ethan knew that everything in his life was about to change. He didn't know how he would do it, but he was determined to find a way to protect this fragile, precious thing that was growing between them. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. But the real battle was only just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind for Ethan. He couldn't focus at work, his mind constantly drifting back to Grace's words. "I'm pregnant, Ethan." It was surreal, overwhelming, and yet thrilling. But with every moment of excitement, there came a heavy, unshakable dread. He knew his family too well, knew exactly how they'd react to the news. Grace was everything he wanted, but she was also everything they would never accept. He decided to tell his family over dinner, a typical Harper gathering in their opulent Upper East Side townhouse. The dining room was bathed in the soft glow of chandelier light, the table set with fine china and crystal glasses. His parents, Charles and Victoria Harper, sat at the head, their expressions reflecting the cool, detached superiority that defined them. Ethan's older brother, Julian, was there too, along with his wife, Catherine, who was already eyeing Ethan with suspicion. "Ethan, you're awfully quiet tonight," Julian remarked, slicing through the silence with a smirk. "Something on your mind?" Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He took a deep breath and set down his fork. "Actually, there is. I have something important to tell you all." His mother's eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible shift that only those who knew her well would catch. "Oh, and what might that be, dear?" Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't rehearsed this, hadn't figured out the perfect way to say it. So, he just blurted it out. "Grace and we're having a baby." For a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches unbearably, each second an eternity. Then, Victoria laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "I'm sorry, did I hear you correctly? Grace? You mean that street musician you've been, entertaining yourself with?" "It's not like that," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I love her. We love each other." His father's expression turned cold, his eyes hardening. "This is unacceptable, Ethan. A baby? With a girl like that?" "Dad, no." Charles's voice boomed, the force of it reverberating through the room. "You listen to me. This family has a reputation, a legacy to uphold. You've been careless, and now you're expecting us to welcome this mess into our lives." Catherine exchanged a knowing glance with Julian, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Really, Ethan, what were you thinking? Did you believe bringing home some street performer would be a good look for us?" Ethan felt a rush of anger, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "She's not just a street performer. She's talented, passionate, and kind. She's more than you'll ever know." Julian scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "She's nothing, Ethan. A nobody. And you're throwing your life away for her?" Every word felt like a knife, slicing deeper and deeper into him. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you because it's happening. Grace and I are having this baby, and whether you like it or not, I'm going to be there for her." His father's eyes blazed with anger. "If you do this, you're on your own. No help from us, no support. You'll be cut off. Do you understand? Ethan's heart pounded painfully in his chest. He had expected resistance, but this was an ultimatum he wasn't prepared for. The room felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of their judgment. He thought of Grace, of her smile, of the way she looked at him like he was someone worth believing in. He thought of their child, a tiny life that depended on him. And then, in that moment, the fear took over. "I need time to think," he muttered, his voice strained. He turned on his heel and left the dining room, the murmurs of disapproval chasing him out. Outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. He stumbled down the steps, gasping for breath, his mind a chaotic whirl of emotions. He felt like he was being torn apart, caught between two worlds, one of comfort and expectation, the other of love and uncertainty. He wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, the city's lights blurring as he tried to make sense of the turmoil inside him. How could he choose? How could he abandon his family, the life he'd been groomed for? But how could he turn his back on Grace, on their baby? Eventually, he found himself in front of Grace's tiny apartment. His heart ached as he climbed the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of his indecision. He hesitated outside her door, hand raised to knock, but before he could, it swung open. Grace stood there, her face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded as she took in his expression. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "I told them," he said hoarsely. "My family. About the baby." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. "And they didn't take it well." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "They want me to choose, Grace, between you and them." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she held his gaze, her voice steady. "I won't ask you to choose, Ethan. I won't be the reason you lose your family." "Grace." "No, listen to me." She stepped closer, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. "I love you, and I'll love this baby, whether you're with us or not. But you have to make this decision for yourself. Not for them, not for me. For you." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, his world crumbling. He wanted to be strong, to promise her the world, but he was so scared. "I need time," he whispered, his voice raw. "I need to think." Grace nodded, tears spilling over now. "Take all the time you need. But please, don't keep us waiting forever." He pulled her into his arms, holding on as if she were his lifeline, the only real thing in a world that was spinning out of control. He didn't know how long they stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, but when he finally pulled away, he saw the resolve in her eyes, the acceptance. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I love you so much." "And I love you," she whispered, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. "But love isn't enough, is it?" Her words were a dagger to his heart, but he couldn't deny them. He kissed her then, a desperate, aching kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow. And when he finally stepped back, it felt like leaving a part of himself behind. "I'll be back," he promised, but even as he said it, a part of him wasn't sure if he believed it. Grace nodded, watching as he turned and walked away, her arms wrapping around her belly, holding their child close. The door closed softly behind him, and the night swallowed him whole. Ethan wandered through the empty streets, lost and alone, his mind replaying their conversation over and over. He knew he was at a crossroads, and whatever decision he made would change everything. The question was, did he have the strength to make the right one? Ethan's world became a haze of confusion and dread in the days that followed. His thoughts were consumed by Grace, by her strength, her courage, and the life growing inside her. Yet, the echoes of his family's harsh words reverberated in his mind, their disapproval looming like a dark cloud over every moment of hope and joy he felt. He wanted to be strong, to stand by Grace and their child, but the fear of losing everything he had ever known was suffocating. He barely slept, tossing and turning in the darkness, his mind spiraling with doubts and fears. Work became an afterthought, his performance slipping as he struggled to keep his composure. Colleagues noticed the change, whispers following him down the hallways, but he was too consumed by his own turmoil to care. One evening, after another sleepless night, he found himself at his parents' townhouse once again. The silence of the place was oppressive, the grandeur of the rooms feeling more like a prison than a home. His father was in his study, sitting behind the massive mahogany desk that had been a symbol of his authority for as long as Ethan could remember. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air. "Father," Ethan began, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you." Charles Harper looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Have you come to your senses, Ethan?" Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I can't abandon her. Grace and the baby, they're my family too." His father's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with eyes that were cold and unforgiving. "I see. And you're willing to give up everything for them? Your career, your future, everything we've worked to build for you." "It's not about giving up, Dad. It's about doing what's right." Charles scoffed, a bitter smile curving his lips. "Doing what's right? For whom? Exactly? That girl? You're blinded by some misplaced sense of responsibility, Ethan. You've always been too soft-hearted, too easily swayed by emotions." Ethan felt a surge of anger, a fierce, protective instinct that was as unexpected as it was powerful. "It's not just about her. It's about our child. My child. Don't you understand that?" His father's expression hardened, and he stood, his imposing figure towering over Ethan. "What I understand is that you're throwing away your life for a mistake. You're being reckless, and I won't stand by and watch you destroy yourself over some fleeting infatuation." "It's not a mistake," Ethan shouted, his voice shaking with frustration. "I love her, and I'm not going to let you bully me into abandoning her." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent, furious standoff. Then, Charles's eyes narrowed, and he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "If you walk out of here and choose her, you're on your own. No more support, no more safety net. You want to play house with that girl, you do it without my help." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, had braced himself for it, but hearing it out loud was like being plunged into icy water. His entire life, his career, his future, everything he had ever known, was being held hostage, dangled in front of him like a lifeline that would be cruelly yanked away the moment he reached for it. And for a split second, he faltered. He thought of the nights he and Grace had spent dreaming about their future, the plans they had made, the love they had shared. But then he thought of the crushing burden of failure, of becoming a disappointment to everyone who had ever believed in him. The fear wrapped itself around his heart like a vice, squeezing until he could barely breathe. I just need more time," he whispered, hating himself for the weakness in his voice. "I need to think." His father's expression didn't change. "Think all you want, Ethan. But know this, once you cross that line, there's no coming back." Ethan left the house in a daze, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and self-loathing. He walked for hours, the cold air stinging his face, trying to make sense of the chaos inside him. When he finally reached Grace's apartment, he felt like a ghost of himself, hollow and aching. She opened the door, her face lighting up with hope that quickly faded as she saw the turmoil in his eyes. "Ethan, what's wrong?" He stepped inside, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "I'm trying, Grace. I'm trying to be strong, but I'm so scared." Her eyes softened, and she took his hands in hers, squeezing gently. "I know, Ethan, but we can do this. Together." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her gaze, and felt something inside him break. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't want to lose any of this." "Then don't," she said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. But it wasn't easy. It was the hardest thing he had ever faced. He felt trapped, torn between two impossible choices. And in the end, the fear won. "I need to go," he said abruptly, his voice hollow. He saw the flash of pain in her eyes, but he couldn't stop himself. I need to clear my head." Grace nodded, her face pale. "Okay, take all the time you need." Ethan leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart breaking with every second that passed. "I love you, Grace. I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, don't leave us." But he was already halfway out the door, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn around, to stay. He didn't know how long he walked or where he was going, but when he finally stopped, he was standing in front of the building he had once called home, staring up at the darkened windows. It was over. He knew at the moment he stepped inside, the cold emptiness of the place reflecting the hollow ache in his chest. He had made his choice, and it felt like tearing his own heart out. He stumbled to his bedroom, collapsing on the bed, his body shaking with silent sobs. He had wanted to be strong, to be the man Grace and their child deserved, but he had failed. He had let his fear win, had let the weight of his family's expectations crush him. He was a coward, and he had lost everything because of it. The days blurred together in a fog of numbness and regret. He avoided Grace's calls, unable to face her, to hear the hurt and betrayal in her voice. He threw himself into work, trying to drown out the agony with endless meetings and deadlines. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her voice, felt the ghost of her touch. And he knew, deep down, that he had made the worst mistake of his life. The days turned into weeks, and then months. Ethan's life moved forward, but it felt as if he were drifting through a fog, every step heavy with regret. He had buried himself in his work, rising through the corporate ranks, achieving the kind of success his family had always expected of him. But none of it brought him peace. Every accolade, every promotion, felt hollow, a cruel reminder of everything he had sacrificed. He avoided the places that reminded him of Grace, avoided people who might mention her name. But it didn't matter how far he ran. Memories of her were everywhere. He would catch a glimpse of a street performer playing the violin, and his heart would ache with the ghost of her music. He'd see a couple laughing together in a cafe, and he'd remember the way Grace's eyes sparkled when she smiled. Each reminder was a dagger twisting deeper into a wound that never healed. And then there were the dreams. In his sleep, he was haunted by the life he could have had, the life he had thrown away. He would dream of a little girl with auburn hair and eyes as green as the sea, a child who called him Daddy, with a voice full of love and trust. He would dream of Grace, standing in the doorway of a cozy home that wasn't his, her smile sad and resigned as she watched him walk away. He would wake up gasping, the pain so real it felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. He would lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of his apartment pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. The success he had once craved now felt like a prison, the walls closing in, suffocating him. He had tried to reach out to Grace once, months after he had walked away. The guilt had become unbearable, and he needed to know how she was, needed to hear her voice. But when he called, the number was disconnected. He tried again and again, each attempt a desperate plea, but she had vanished from his life as completely as if she had never existed. He considered going to her apartment, but fear held him back. What if she had moved on? What if she didn't want to see him, to hear his apologies? What if she had found someone else, someone better than the coward he had proven himself to be? The thought of facing her rejection was more than he could bear, so he did nothing. And every day that passed only widened the chasm between them, making it harder to bridge. Years slipped by, and Ethan became a man defined by his regrets. He attended family gatherings, his parents and brother congratulating him on his accomplishments, never mentioning the past, as if Grace and their child were just a bad dream that had faded with time. He let them believe he had moved on, let them see the facade of a man who had everything he could ever want. But at night, when he was alone, the truth would creep in, suffocating him with its relentless grip. He would stare at the ceiling, imagining the life he had lost. The little girl who would be starting school by now, the woman he had loved more than he had ever loved anyone. He wondered if Grace was happy, if she had found peace without him. He prayed that she had, even though the thought of her with someone else made his heart feel like it was being crushed. It was on a night like this, when the weight of his choices felt particularly unbearable, that he received an invitation that would change everything. It was a crisp autumn evening, and Ethan was in his office, staring blankly at a stack of papers that he had no will to address. His assistant knocked softly on the door, entering with a formal envelope in hand. "Mr. Harper, this just came for you. It's an invitation to a charity gala next week." Ethan took the envelope, his fingers brushing over the elegant script. He had received countless invitations like this over the years, but something about this one made his pulse quicken. He opened it slowly, scanning the details. It was a fundraising event for a new foundation supporting young musicians, hosted by none other than Grace Dawson. His heart stopped. He read the words again and again, unable to believe what he was seeing. Grace was back. She was here, in the city, hosting an event that would undoubtedly be filled with people he knew. She hadn't disappeared. She had rebuilt her life, had risen to heights he could only imagine, and she was doing it without him. His hands shook as he set the invitation down, his mind racing. This was his chance to see her, to apologize, to say everything he should have said all those years ago. But the fear was there too, the fear that she wouldn't want to see him, that his presence would only bring her pain. He spent the next week in a haze of anxiety and anticipation. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep. The thought of seeing her again was both exhilarating and terrifying. He pictured her in his mind, the way she had looked the last time he saw her, standing in her small apartment, tears in her eyes as she begged him not to leave. But he had left. And now, after 8 years of silence, he didn't know if she would even speak to him. The night of the gala arrived, and Ethan found himself standing outside the grand venue, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped inside. The place was filled with the city's elite, the air buzzing with chatter and the clinking of glasses. He moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning every face, his pulse racing with a mix of hope and dread. And then he saw her. Grace stood near the stage, surrounded by people, her laughter carrying over the noise of the room. She was radiant, more beautiful than he remembered, her presence commanding the attention of everyone around her. She was talking animatedly, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. But it wasn't just her. Standing beside her, clutching a small violin case, was a little girl with auburn hair and eyes that were a mirror of his own. She was laughing up at Grace, her expression bright and eager, and Ethan felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. It was her, their daughter, the child he had walked away from, the life he had abandoned. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him, joy, guilt, despair. He wanted to run to them, to throw himself at Grace's feet and beg for forgiveness. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything over the roar of his own fear. He watched as Grace turned, her eyes sweeping the room, and then their gazes locked. For a moment, everything else faded away, and it was just the two of them, the years and the pain and the distance melting into nothing. Her expression froze, shock and something else, something unreadable, flickering across her face. Ethan felt his heart break all over again. He had come here hoping for a chance, but now, seeing her like this, seeing the life she had built without him, he didn't know if he had the right to ask for anything at all. But he had to try. He owed it to her, to their daughter, to himself. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his heart in his throat, praying that it wasn't too late to make things right. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he made his way through the crowd, his eyes never leaving Grace and the little girl beside her. Every step felt like it took an eternity, the distance between them both agonizingly short and impossibly vast. He felt like he was walking into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, unsure of what awaited him when he finally reached her. Grace stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. He saw the shock in her eyes, the questions, and something darker, a wariness that hadn't been there before. His heart ached at the sight of it, knowing he had put it there, that he was the reason she looked at him like he was a stranger. Finally, he was in front of her, his words lodged in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Grace," he breathed, barely able to get the word out. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if she were trying to reconcile the man standing before her with the memories she held. Then, With a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped back, her expression guarded. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, an edge that made him flinch. He glanced at the little girl, their daughter, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes, and felt a rush of longing so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. I came to see you. Both of you," he said, his voice cracking. He forced himself to meet her gaze, to not look away even though it hurt. "I got the invitation, and I had to come." Grace's eyes flashed with something like disbelief. "After 8 years? You just had to come?" The bitterness in her tone cut deep, but he knew he deserved it. Every word was a reminder of the choices he had made, the pain he had caused. "I know I have no right to be here, Grace, but I've thought about you every day since I left." "I've thought about her," he said, nodding towards their daughter, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of confusion and fascination. Grace's jaw tightened, and she glanced around, her gaze flicking to the people nearby who were starting to take notice of their conversation. "This isn't the place for this, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice strained. "We're here for the foundation, for the kids. This isn't about you." Ethan felt the sting of her words, but he nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand, but please, can we talk? Just for a few minutes?" She hesitated, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read his intentions. Then, with a sigh, she glanced down at their daughter. "Lila, sweetheart, why don't you go find Aunt Sarah? She's by the stage." The little girl, Lila, looked up at her mother, then back at Ethan, her small face scrunching in confusion. "But who is he, Mama?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known it would come, had braced himself for it, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of pain. Grace's expression softened as she knelt down to Lila's level, her voice gentle but firm. "He's someone from a long time ago, sweetie. Someone I used to know. But right now, I need to talk to him. Okay? Just for a little while." Lila looked uncertain, her gaze shifting back to Ethan, and he saw himself reflected in those green eyes. Eyes that were so achingly familiar. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but he was paralyzed, every word he wanted to say turning to ash in his mouth. "Okay, Mama," Lila said finally, her voice small. She glanced at Ethan once more, then turned and scampered off towards the stage, her tiny figure disappearing into the crowd. Grace straightened, crossing her arms over her chest as she faced him again. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan flinched at the coldness in her voice, but he nodded. "I know, but I had to. I've been living with this guilt for so long, Grace. I need to make things right." Her laugh was bitter, harsh. "Make things right? Do you have any idea what that even means? Do you think you can just show up after all this time and, apologize? Pretend that you didn't abandon us?" The words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. He swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm not here to pretend anything, Grace. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try. I want to be a part of her life, of your life, if you'll let me." Grace shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and something else, something that looked painfully like heartbreak. "You don't get to do that, Ethan. You don't get to walk back into our lives and just decide to be a father. You left. You made that choice." "I was scared," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was a coward, and I've regretted it every single day. Please, Grace, just give me a chance to prove that I've changed." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, and he could see the battle raging inside her. The love that hadn't quite died, warring with the pain he had caused. Finally, she let out a shuddering breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of it all was too much to bear. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can let you hurt us again." His heart clenched at the raw pain in her words. "I won't, Grace. I swear I won't. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust, to be there for both of you." She glanced away, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You don't understand what it was like, raising her on my own, wondering every day if I'd made the right choice by keeping her. knowing you were out there living your life while we were struggling to get by. Ethan's chest tightened, the guilt nearly overwhelming. I'm so sorry, Grace. I wish I could go back and change everything. I wish I'd been there for you, for her. But I can't. All I can do is try to be here now. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the noise of the gala fading into the background. Then Grace nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. I don't know if this is a good idea, she said quietly, but for Lila's sake, I'll let you try. Relief and hope surged through him, and he took a step closer, his voice trembling. Thank you, Grace. I promise I won't let you down. She held up a hand, stopping him. This isn't about us, Ethan. It's about her. If you're serious about being in her life, you have to prove it. To both of us. He nodded, his heart pounding. I will. I promise. Grace glanced towards the stage, where Lila was talking animatedly with one of the other musicians. We'll start slow. Visits, maybe. I need time to figure this out, and so does she. Ethan followed her gaze, his heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope as he looked at his daughter, the child he had never known, but whom he already loved more than anything. Whatever you need, Grace. I'll do whatever it takes. She nodded, then turned back to him, her expression still guarded but softer now, the anger replaced by something closer to resignation. I'll hold you to that, Ethan, because if you break her heart, if you break my heart again, there won't be any more chances. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy mantle. I understand. They stood there for a moment longer, the past and the present colliding in a way that was both painful and strangely hopeful. And then, with a small, hesitant smile, Grace stepped back, gesturing towards Lila. Come meet your daughter. The words sent a shock of emotion through him, and he felt his throat tighten as he nodded, his heart racing. He followed her to where Lila stood, his hands shaking, his entire body trembling with nerves. Lila, Grace said gently, kneeling down beside her daughter. There's someone I want you to meet. Lila looked up, her green eyes wide and curious as they flicked between Grace and Ethan. Who is he, Mama? Grace's gaze softened as she glanced up at Ethan, then back at Lila. This is Ethan, sweetheart. He's your father. The words hung in the air, and Ethan felt the world tilt on its axis as he looked into the eyes of his daughter for the first time, the realization hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. His heart felt like it might burst, a million emotions swirling inside him. Love, guilt, hope, fear. Lila's eyes widened, and she looked up at him with a mixture of wonder and confusion. You're my daddy? Ethan's throat closed up, and he had to swallow hard to find his voice. Yes, Lila, I'm your daddy. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze intense, and then, with the innocence of a child, she smiled. A smile that lit up her entire face, that was so open and pure it made his heart ache. Hi, Daddy. The words were simple, but they were everything. Ethan felt his eyes burn with tears as he knelt down, his voice trembling. Hi, Lila. I'm so happy to finally meet you. And as he reached out, his hand shaking, and she took it in her small, warm one, he felt something inside him heal, a wound that had been festering for 8 long years, finally beginning to close. He looked up at Grace, his heart overflowing with gratitude and love, and saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something like hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And in that moment, he knew that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build the family he had always dreamed of. The weeks following the gala were a cautious dance of tentative steps and measured progress. Ethan was careful not to push too hard, respecting Grace's boundaries while still striving to show his commitment to being a father to Lila. He knew he couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the years of absence and pain, but he was determined to make up for it as best he could. It started with short visits. Ethan would come by Grace's apartment in the late afternoons, bringing small gifts for Lila, books, art supplies, things that showed he was paying attention to who she was, what she liked. Grace watched him closely, her eyes never leaving him as he and Lila navigated this strange, fragile bond they were building. Lila was cautious at first, her small face a mask of curiosity and confusion. She asked endless questions. Why had he been gone so long? Did he love her? Was he going to stay? Each question was like a knife twisting in Ethan's heart, a reminder of everything he had missed, everything he had failed to be. But he answered them as best he could, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I didn't know how to be a good dad, Lila, he told her one day, his voice thick with emotion. I was scared, but I'm here now, and I promise I'm not going anywhere. She had looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes, his eyes, searching his face as if she were trying to see into his soul. Then she had nodded, just once, and slipped her small hand into his. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. Each visit seemed to bring them closer, the awkwardness gradually giving way to something warmer, something real. They played games together, worked on puzzles, and Lila would eagerly show him her drawings, her fingers stained with the vibrant colors of her imagination. Ethan marveled at her creativity, at the way she seemed to see the world with such wonder and hope. One evening, as they sat on the living room floor, Lila carefully arranging the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, she looked up at him, her expression serious. Are you going to be my daddy forever? The question hit him like a punch to the gut, but he managed to keep his voice steady. Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to be here for as long as you want me to be. She frowned slightly, as if trying to understand something beyond her years. Even if mommy gets mad at you? Ethan glanced at Grace, who was standing in the kitchen, her back to them as she pretended to be busy with the dishes. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the sink. Even then, he said softly, no matter what, I'm not going to leave again. Lila seemed to consider this, then nodded, her tiny brow furrowed in concentration as she returned to the puzzle. Ethan watched her, his heart swelling with love and guilt and a fierce protectiveness he had never known he was capable of. He had missed so much. Her first steps, her first words, all the milestones that he could never get back. But he was here now, and he would fight for every moment they had left. As the days turned into weeks, he began to see the walls around Grace's heart start to crack, the anger and pain that had defined their interactions softening into something more vulnerable, more tentative. She would watch him with Lila, her expression a mix of hope and fear, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to run away again. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to take Lila to Central Park. It was a crisp autumn day, the trees ablaze with fiery reds and golds, the air filled with the sound of laughter and the distant strum of street musicians. Lila ran ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased after a flock of pigeons, her auburn hair shining in the sunlight. Ethan and Grace walked behind her, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken words. He glanced at her, his heart aching with everything he wanted to say but didn't know how. She's amazing, Grace, he said finally, his voice quiet. You've done such an incredible job raising her. Grace's eyes softened, but there was a wariness there too, a hesitation that spoke of wounds that hadn't fully healed. She's my whole world, Ethan. I just want to protect her. I know, he said, his voice thick, and I want to help you do that. I want to be the kind of father she deserves. Grace looked away, her gaze following Lila as she spun in circles, her arms outstretched like wings. It's not just about being there, Ethan. It's about staying. Through the hard times, the messy times. It's about not running when things get tough. I won't run, he said, his voice firm. Not again. She turned to face him then, her eyes searching his, and he could see the fear and hope warring within her. It's easy to say that now, when things are good. But what happens when it's not so easy? What happens when you get scared again? The question hung between them, heavy and raw. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart pounding. I'm not that person anymore, Grace. I know I made mistakes, huge, unforgivable mistakes. But I've changed, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you, to her, if you'll let me. She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded, as if coming to a decision. Okay, but this is your last chance, Ethan. If you hurt her again, if you hurt us again, there won't be another. I understand, he said softly, the gravity of her words sinking into him like a stone. And I won't. The days that followed were filled with small moments of connection and healing. Ethan would pick Lila up from school, and they would spend the afternoons together. At the park, at the museum, even just walking through the city, exploring the world through her eyes. He cherished every second, every laugh, every question she asked with that fierce, bright curiosity that never seemed to dim. Grace began to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing as she watched them together. There were still moments when he could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that this was all too good to be true, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. She even started joining them on their outings, the three of them forming a tentative, fragile unit that felt more like a family with each passing day. One evening, after they had put Lila to bed, they sat on the couch, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. Grace seemed lost in thought, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked gently, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm thinking about us. About what we were, what we could have been." His heart clenched at the sadness in her voice. "Grace, she shook her head, cutting him off. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, Ethan. I've spent so many years building walls around my heart, trying to protect myself and Lila. It's hard to let those walls down, even now." "I know," he said softly, "and I'm not asking you to let them down all at once. Just let me in, a little at a time." She gave him a small, wistful smile, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I want to, but I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared that if I let you in, I'll lose you again. And I don't know if I can survive that." He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm and steady. "You won't lose me, Grace. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, her gaze searching his, and for the first time in a long time, he saw a glimmer of hope, of something like trust, in her eyes. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay." And as they sat there, their hands intertwined, the city lights casting a soft glow around them, Ethan felt something shift between them. Something that had been broken for so long finally beginning to heal. He knew they still had a long way to go, that there would be challenges and setbacks and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years. He felt hope. As winter set in, the city transformed into a wonderland of twinkling lights and snow-covered streets. For Ethan, each passing day felt like a fragile gift, one that he held with both gratitude and trepidation. His relationship with Lila was blossoming, their bond growing stronger with every shared laugh, every bedtime story, every moment spent together. But with each step forward, there was also the ever-present fear that it could all crumble. Grace had softened toward him, but her wariness lingered just beneath the surface. He could see it in the way she sometimes looked at him, as if waiting for him to prove this was all real, that he wouldn't disappear again. He couldn't blame her. His past actions had left scars that would take time, if ever, to fully heal. One cold afternoon, just days before Christmas, Ethan picked Lila up from school. Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes sparkling as she clutched a brightly wrapped package in her mittened hands. "Look what I made, Daddy!" she exclaimed, holding the package up for him to see. Ethan's heart swelled at the word, Daddy. It still felt new, almost surreal, every time she said it. He crouched down, smiling as he took the gift. "What is it, sweetheart?" "It's a present for you and Mommy," she said proudly. "I made it in art class." He glanced at the lumpy, uneven wrapping, a surge of love and pride washing over him. "Thank you, Lila. We're going to love it, whatever it is." Lila beamed, and they walked home together, her small hand nestled in his. As they turned the corner onto their street, Lila chattered away about her day, her excitement infectious. Ethan found himself imagining future Christmases, the three of them together, the life he had always dreamed of but never thought he could have. When they arrived at Grace's apartment, the warmth of the holiday decorations welcomed them. The tree in the corner sparkled with lights, and the scent of fresh pine filled the air. Grace was in the kitchen, her back to them as she hummed softly to herself. "Mommy, look," Lila called, rushing forward with the package. "I made this for you and Daddy." Grace turned, her smile genuine as she knelt down to accept the gift. "What is it, sweetheart?" "It's a surprise," Lila said, bouncing on her toes. "You have to open it together." Grace's eyes flicked to Ethan, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. He joined them, and together they carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a small clay sculpture, 3 figures standing side by side, their hands linked. It was crude, misshapen, but to Ethan it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Lila's voice was soft, hopeful. "It's us, our family." Grace's breath hitched, and Ethan saw the tears glistening in her eyes. She reached out, gently tracing the small figures with her fingers. "It's beautiful, Lila. Thank you." The 3 of them sat there, the quiet moment stretching into something profound and precious. For the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly a family, united in a way that went beyond words. But as much as things seemed to be improving, Ethan knew that trust was still fragile, and it would take just one mistake to shatter it. A week later, the phone call came. Ethan was at work, reviewing a contract, when his assistant knocked on the door, her expression tense. "Mr. Harper, there's an urgent call for you on line 2. It's about your daughter." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He grabbed the phone, his heart pounding. "This is Ethan Harper." "Mr. Harper, this is St. Luke's Hospital. Your daughter, Lila, was brought in a little while ago. She's stable now, but we need you to come down." For a moment, everything went dark, his mind a whirl of panic and fear. What happened? Is she? She had an asthma attack. It was severe, but she's going to be okay. Please come as soon as you can. Ethan didn't remember leaving the office, didn't remember the drive to the hospital. All he knew was the gut-wrenching terror that something had happened to Lila, that he might lose her before he had really gotten to know her. When he burst through the doors of the emergency room, he spotted Grace immediately. She was standing outside her room, her face pale, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Her eyes widened when she saw him, a mixture of relief and fear washing over her features. "Grace, what happened? Is she okay?" He was breathless, frantic, the need to see Lila, to hold her, overwhelming him. "She's okay," Grace said softly, her voice trembling. "It was an asthma attack. I didn't even know she had asthma. She'd never had an episode like this before." Ethan felt his knees go weak, a rush of relief and guilt crashing over him. "I didn't know either. I should have known. I should have." Grace reached out, her hand gripping his arm, her touch grounding him. "It's not your fault, Ethan. We didn't know. She's okay now, that's what matters." He nodded, swallowing hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Can I see her?" Grace stepped aside, letting him into the room. Lila was lying in the bed, small and fragile, her eyes closed. An oxygen mask covered her face, and her chest rose and fell steadily. Ethan's heart twisted at the sight of her, the fear of losing her still raw and sharp. "Daddy?" Lila's voice was small, muffled by the mask, but her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, they lit up. Ethan rushed to her side, his hand gently brushing her hair back. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Lila reached out, her tiny fingers curling around his. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to make you worried." His heart broke at her words, the innocence in her voice. "It's not your fault, Lila. I'm just so glad you're okay." They stayed like that for what felt like hours, Ethan holding her hand, whispering words of comfort and love. Grace stood quietly by the door, her eyes never leaving them. There was something in her gaze, something fragile and hopeful, that made his chest tighten. After a while, the doctor came in, explaining Lila's condition, how she would need medication and monitoring, but that she would be okay. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every word, every detail, vowing silently to never let anything happen to her again. When Lila finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan turned to Grace. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I should have been there. I should have known." Grace shook her head, her eyes softening. Ethan, you were here when it mattered. You showed up. That's what's important. He took a deep breath, the fear and guilt still gnawing at him. I don't want to lose her, Grace. I don't want to lose either of you. Her expression softened, and she took his hand, squeezing it gently. You won't, but you have to believe that you're enough, Ethan. For her. For me. He looked at her, his heart aching with everything he wanted to say, everything he felt. I'm trying, Grace. I'm trying so hard. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I know you are, and I'm trying too. They stood there, their hands intertwined, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises and tentative hope. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a certainty that he hadn't felt in a long time. I love you, Grace, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I've always loved you, and I want to be the man you and Lila deserve. Grace's breath caught, her eyes searching his, the vulnerability in her gaze taking his breath away. I love you too, Ethan, but I need to know that this time, you're really here, that you won't run. I won't, he said, his voice steady, his heart full. I'm here. For good. She nodded slowly, her lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. Okay, let's take it one day at a time. For Lila. For us. Ethan's heart soared, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her against him, the steady beat of her heart. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt, but he was ready to face them, ready to fight for the life he wanted. With Grace, with Lila, because this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Winter turned into spring, the city shedding its icy shell as new life blossomed in every corner. For Ethan, each day felt like a fresh start, a chance to prove his dedication to Grace and Lila. He cherished every moment with his daughter, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. He took her to the park, attended her school events, and spent countless hours playing and talking, learning about the small and big things that made her who she was. But it wasn't just Lila who was letting him in. Grace, too, was slowly lowering her walls. They began spending more time together outside of their co-parenting responsibilities. They'd take walks through the city, share quiet dinners after Lila had gone to bed, and talk about everything they'd once been afraid to say. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of hesitation, of doubt, but they were trying, both of them, and that made all the difference. One evening, after they'd put Lila to bed, they sat together on the couch, a comfortable silence settling between them. Grace leaned back, her head resting against the cushion, her eyes closed. Ethan watched her, his heart full of so much love it felt like it might burst. Grace, he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. She opened her eyes, looking at him with that mix of warmth and caution that had become so familiar. Yeah, I've been thinking, I want us to go away for a weekend, just the three of us. Somewhere quiet, where we can just be together. Her brows furrowed slightly, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. You mean, like a vacation? Yeah, kind of, he said, squeezing her hand gently. It doesn't have to be far. Maybe a cabin in the mountains, or a little beach house. I just want us to have some time away from everything. No distractions, no work, just us. Grace bit her lip, her eyes dropping to their intertwined hands. Ethan, I don't know. Things are good right now, but what if it's too much, too soon? He nodded, understanding her hesitation. I get it. I really do. But I want to show you both that I'm serious, that I'm here for the long haul. And I think we need this, Grace. Time to just breathe, to be a family. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. Then she looked up at him, something like hope shining in her eyes. Okay, let's do it. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming. He leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Thank you, Grace. You won't regret it, I promise. They decided on a small cabin near the Catskills, a place surrounded by towering trees and quiet lakes. The drive up was filled with Lila's excited chatter, her face pressed against the window as she marveled at the changing scenery. Ethan and Grace exchanged smiles, a warm, quiet understanding passing between them. This was the first time they'd done anything like this as a family, and the significance of it wasn't lost on either of them. The cabin was cozy and inviting, with large windows that looked out onto a peaceful lake and a fireplace that crackled softly in the corner. Lila ran through the rooms, her laughter echoing as she explored every nook and cranny. Grace watched her, a tender smile on her lips, and Ethan felt a surge of gratitude, so strong it made his chest ache. The first evening was perfect. They roasted marshmallows over the fire, Lila's face sticky with melted chocolate as she giggled and told stories about her school friends. Grace's laughter blended with their daughters, and Ethan found himself sitting back, just watching them, his heart full to bursting. This was what he had dreamed of for so long. A family, together, happy. Later, after Lila had fallen asleep in the small bedroom, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets as they watched the moonlight dance on the lake. The air was crisp and cool, the silence around them peaceful and serene. "Thank you for this," Grace said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Ethan turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "For what?" "For being here. For trying. For us." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I didn't think I'd ever get this back, Ethan. I didn't think I'd want to." His heart ached at her words, the vulnerability in her voice. "I'm so sorry, Grace. For everything. I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back, but I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me." She looked at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you, Ethan. I never stopped, but I'm still scared. Scared that this is all just temporary. That one day I'll wake up and you'll be gone again." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that slipped free. "I'm not going anywhere, Grace. Not ever again. I promise you that." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if she were savoring the moment, memorizing it. When she opened them again, there was a quiet determination there, a strength that made his heart swell with love and admiration. "Okay," she whispered, "then let's do this. Let's be a family." The next few days were a blur of laughter and simple, joyful moments. They hiked through the woods, explored the lakeshore, and spent long afternoons curled up together with books and games. Lila was radiant, her joy contagious as she basked in the presence of both her parents. Grace and Ethan moved closer to each other, the barriers that had stood between them for so long finally beginning to crumble. But as much as everything seemed perfect, there was still one shadow that loomed over Ethan's happiness: his parents. He hadn't spoken to them in months, not since he had begun to rebuild his relationship with Grace and Lila. He knew he couldn't avoid the confrontation forever, knew that at some point he would have to face them, to make them understand that his priorities had changed. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. On the last night of their trip, as they sat around the fireplace, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart sink. His father's name flashed across the display. "Are you going to answer that?" Grace's voice was quiet, her eyes thoughtful as she looked at him. He hesitated, then nodded, standing and stepping outside. The air was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. He took a deep breath and answered the call. "Dad." "Ethan." His father's voice was clipped, formal. "It's been a while." "Yes, it has," Ethan said, his hand tightening around the phone. He knew what was coming, could almost feel the weight of his father's disapproval across the miles. "We need to talk about this situation with Grace and the child." Ethan felt a surge of anger, his free hand curling into a fist. "Her name is Lila, and she's not the child, Dad. She's my daughter." There was a pause, and when his father spoke again, his voice was icy. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. This relationship, this family you're trying to build, it's going to cost you everything. Your career, your reputation. Are you really willing to throw it all away for a woman who's been nothing but a burden?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but this time, instead of shrinking back, he felt a surge of resolve. "She's not a burden, Dad. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And so is Lila. I don't care about the career or the reputation. I care about them. And if you can't accept that, then maybe I'm better off without everything you're offering. There was silence on the other end, and Ethan could almost see his father's face, the shock, the anger. For the first time in his life, he felt free from the expectations, from the pressure, from the constant need to please. Ethan, if you go through with this, if you choose them over everything we've built, I've already chosen, Ethan interrupted, his voice steady, calm. And I'm not going to change my mind. His father's voice was cold, final. Then you're no longer my son. The words should have hurt, should have felt like a wound, but instead, they left him with a strange, calm clarity. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm not going to walk away from Grace and Lila. I love them, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that. He hung up, the silence that followed almost deafening. He stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting at his skin, his heart pounding with the intensity of what had just happened. He had finally done it. He had finally stood up to his father, had finally chosen his own path. When he went back inside, Grace was waiting for him, her eyes full of questions. He walked over to her, his heart full of everything he couldn't put into words. He took her hand, pulling her close, his voice steady, certain. I chose you, Grace. I chose us. And I'll keep choosing us every day for the rest of my life. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, and then she smiled. A smile so full of love and hope that it took his breath away. Then let's go home, she whispered, her voice full of promise. Let's go home and start the rest of our lives together. Ethan nodded, his heart soaring. They had faced the past, had fought through the pain and the fear, and now, finally, they were ready to move forward, together. Returning to the city, Ethan, Grace, and Lila settled into a new rhythm. They grew closer as a family, embracing simple moments that felt profound. School pickups, bedtime stories, shared dinners. Each day, Ethan felt more rooted in the life he had almost lost, grateful for every second he spent with Grace and Lila. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Lila nestled between them. She looked up with wide eyes. Daddy, are we going to stay like this? You, me, and Mommy? Ethan's heart tightened. He glanced at Grace, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. Yes, Lila, we're a family, and that's never going to change. Lila's face lit up, and she hugged him tightly. I love you, Daddy. He kissed the top of her head, emotion thick in his voice. I love you too, sweetheart, more than anything. Later, after putting Lila to bed, Ethan and Grace lingered in the quiet living room. I've been thinking, he began, taking her hand. I want us to take a trip, just the three of us. A weekend away to relax and be together. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Okay, let's do it. They chose a small cabin in the Catskills. The weekend was perfect, hiking, playing by the lake, and cozy evenings by the fire. For the first time, they felt truly united, the barriers between them dissolving. One night, as they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, Ethan turned to Grace. I'm all in. For you, for us, for Lila. I want this forever. Grace looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. I'm all in, too. I love you, Ethan. They kissed, the promise of a shared future in that single, tender moment. Back in the city, life returned to its familiar rhythm. One evening, Ethan's phone buzzed. His father's name flashed on the screen. He stepped outside to take the call, his heart racing. Ethan, I was wrong, his father said, voice strained. I want to meet Grace and Lila. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Okay, Dad, but it has to be on our terms. Grace and Lila come first. Of course, his father replied. Thank you, son. When he shared the news with Grace, she squeezed his hand. Let's give it a try. For Lila, the following weekend, they met his parents. It was tense at first, but Lila's innocence bridged the gap, her laughter softening even the hardest hearts. Ethan watched, his heart swelling as his father knelt to talk to Lila, genuinely interested, a small smile on his face. His mother, tentative but sincere, turned to Grace. I'm sorry. We want to make this right. Grace nodded, a gentle smile on her lips. We'll take it one step at a time. As they parted, Ethan's father pulled him aside. I'm proud of you, Ethan, for choosing your family. Ethan nodded, emotion thick in his throat. Thank you, Dad. They walked away together, Grace's hand in his, Lila's small fingers wrapped around his other hand. As they left the park, Ethan felt a deep, abiding peace. They had faced the past, healed old wounds, and were finally moving forward. This was his family, his home, his everything, and they were exactly where they belonged.